Picture a historian sitting at a desk somewhere, surrounded by books, staring at a question that someone has handed them on a piece of paper. The question is simple. How many civilizations has humanity actually had? The historian picks up a pen, thinks for a moment, and then puts the pen back down. Because the answer depends entirely on what you mean by civilization, and defining that word carefully turns out to be one of the more philosophically demanding exercises in all of human scholarship. Is a civilization a city, a writing system, a centralized government, a shared religion, a complex economy with specialized labor, an agricultural surplus that supports people who don't farm, some combination of all of these? And if the definition requires all of these simultaneously, does that mean the thousands of complex, organized, sophisticated human societies that had some but not all of these features simply don't count? The historian stares at the piece of paper for a while longer. Then they write, "It depends on what you mean, and also considerably more than most people think, and also the question itself contains assumptions that probably need to be examined before the answer is going to make sense." This is going to be one of those videos where we start with a simple question and end up somewhere considerably more interesting than where we began. The number of civilizations humanity has produced turns out to be a window into how we think about human potential, how much of our past has been lost, what the archaeological record actually preserves versus what it misses, and whether the story we tell about human history, the one that starts in Mesopotamia and moves through Greece and Rome toward modernity, is anything like the complete picture. Spoiler, it is not the complete picture, not even close. Before counting civilizations, the definition problem has to be addressed honestly, because the count changes dramatically depending on what criteria you apply. The traditional academic definition of civilization, derived largely from the work of archaeologists in the early and mid-20th century, involves a checklist of features: urban centers, monumental architecture, writing systems, long-distance trade networks, centralized political authority, occupational specialization, and agricultural surplus sufficient to support non-farming populations. This checklist was assembled by scholars primarily familiar with the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, and it reflects the features that those civilizations happened to have. It is, in other words, a definition that was built to describe the civilizations that the people writing it already knew about. The problem with this definition is immediately apparent when you apply it to the full global archaeological record. The ancient Maya had monumental architecture, complex astronomy, sophisticated writing, and elaborate political organization. They clearly qualify. But the Cahokia civilization of the Mississippi River Valley, which at its height around 1100 CE, had a population larger than contemporary London, and produced monumental earthworks visible from great distances, lacked a writing system. Does that disqualify it? The Indus Valley civilization had planned cities with sophisticated drainage infrastructure and standardized weights and measures, but we have not fully deciphered their writing system, and we are not certain about their political organization. Do they qualify with an asterisk? The more useful framework treats civilization not as a binary category. Either you have all the features or you don't count, but as a spectrum of social complexity. All human societies exist somewhere on this spectrum, from small mobile hunter-gatherer bands to enormous modern nation-states. The interesting question is not which societies cross an arbitrary threshold into real civilization, but how many distinct, complex, sophisticated human societies have developed throughout history and across the globe, and what their diversity tells us about human potential. With this broader framing, the number is much larger than the standard historical narrative suggests, and the reasons it is larger are fascinating. The civilizations that most people can name from memory represent a dramatically incomplete sample of what actually existed, biased toward civilizations that had writing systems, existed in environments that preserve organic material poorly, and happened to be encountered and studied by European scholars during the period when academic history was being systematized. The standard list looks something like this: ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, ancient China, the Minoan civilization of Crete, the Mycenaean civilization of Greece, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca. These are the civilizations that appear in most world history textbooks, the ones students encounter repeatedly, the ones whose names have become cultural shorthand for ancient sophistication. This list contains maybe a dozen distinct civilizations, depending on how you count related cultures, and it represents perhaps 3,000 years of recorded history across a handful of geographic regions. Given that anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years and have been organizing into increasingly complex societies for tens of thousands of years, this list represents an extraordinarily thin slice of the actual human past. What fills the rest of that past? The answer, assembled from archaeological evidence accumulated over the past century and accelerating dramatically with new technologies in the past few decades, is a world substantially more populated with complex societies than the traditional narrative acknowledges. The pre-Columbian Americas alone demonstrate the scale of what the traditional list misses. The Cahokia civilization, centered on a site near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, was at its peak around 1050 to 1150 CE, one of the largest cities in the world. The central mound, Monk's Mound, contains more total volume of earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city was planned with deliberate geometry, featuring a large central plaza aligned with astronomical events. Surrounded by a stockade wall enclosing the central ceremonial district, with residential areas extending outward for miles. The population at peak is estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people in the city itself, with a broader regional population much larger. Cahokia is not a culture most people have heard of. It does not appear in most world history curricula. It lacked a writing system as far as current evidence shows, which places it outside the traditional definition of civilization. But its organizational complexity, architectural achievement, and regional influence over a vast area of North America represent a level of social sophistication that is unambiguously complex by any reasonable metric. North America before European contact contained dozens of societies of comparable or greater complexity than anything the traditional narrative acknowledges. The Puebloan cultures of the American Southwest built multi-story apartment complexes housing hundreds of people in planned communities with sophisticated water management infrastructure. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico was the center of a regional network stretching hundreds of miles, connected by roads engineered with careful attention to geometry and probably ritual significance, with great houses aligned to astronomical events with remarkable precision. The Mississippian culture that produced Cahokia extended across much of the eastern half of North America, connecting dozens of complex chiefdoms through trade networks that moved copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and exotic materials across vast distances. South America hosted not just the Inca, the empire encountered and largely destroyed by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, but dozens of civilizations that preceded, coexisted with, and were absorbed by Inca expansion. The Tiwanaku civilization of the Bolivian Altiplano, centered on a city at nearly 4,000 meters elevation, maintained agricultural systems of extraordinary ingenuity, raised field complexes covering vast areas of seasonally flooded lowland that dramatically increased agricultural productivity. The Wari civilization of coastal and highland Peru predated the Inca by centuries and organized a state with planned administrative centers across a large geographic area. The Norte Chico civilization of coastal Peru, dating to roughly 3000 BCE, represents one of the oldest complex societies in the Western Hemisphere, developing urban centers, monumental architecture, and regional organization independently of any contact with the civilizations of the Eastern Hemisphere. Sub-Saharan Africa presents perhaps the most dramatically underrepresented region in standard historical narratives of civilization, and the reasons for this underrepresentation are worth examining because they reveal important things about how the historical record has been constructed. The Kingdom of Kush, based in the Middle Nile region of what is now Sudan, was a sophisticated state that at various points rivaled and even conquered ancient Egypt, ruling the entire Nile Valley for approximately a century as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. Kushite rulers built pyramids, more than 200 of them, more than Egypt itself, developed their own script, organized long-distance trade across the Sahara and the Red Sea, and maintained a complex urban civilization centered on the cities of Kerma, Napata, and eventually Meroe for roughly 3,000 years. Great Zimbabwe, a stone-walled city in what is now Zimbabwe, was the center of a powerful trading state that controlled gold and ivory trade routes between the interior of southern Africa and the Indian Ocean coast from roughly 1100 to 1450 CE. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The Great Enclosure, a massive stone wall constructed without mortar, reaching 11 meters in height and running for over 250 meters, represents an engineering achievement that European colonizers in the 19th century initially refused to attribute to African builders, inventing alternative origin theories that have since been comprehensively debunked by archaeology. The Mali Empire and its successor states, the Songhai Empire, centered on cities like Timbuktu and Jen, organized sophisticated trading states across the Western Sahel from the 13th to the 16th centuries, with Timbuktu serving as a major center of Islamic scholarship with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The Empire of Aksum in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea was one of the major powers of the ancient world from roughly 100 to 940 CE, with its own writing system, monumental architecture, including enormous stone stelae, a coinage system, and trade connections reaching the Roman Empire and the Indian Ocean world. These are not marginal societies on the edges of history. They are complex civilizations by any reasonable definition, each representing distinct traditions of political organization, economic sophistication, and cultural achievement. Their relative absence from standard world history narratives reflects the biases of the scholarly tradition that constructed those narratives rather than the actual historical record. Southeast Asia and the Pacific host additional complex societies that the standard narrative consistently underweights. The Khmer Empire, centered on Angkor in what is now Cambodia, was at its height between the 9th and 15th centuries CE, one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world. The Angkor complex, a vast network of temples, administrative centers, reservoirs, and canals covering more than 1,000 square kilometers, represents an urban planning and hydraulic engineering achievement of the first order. The empire organized rice agriculture across a vast area through sophisticated water management, supporting a population that modern studies estimate in the hundreds of thousands in the greater Angkor urban region. The Majapahit Empire of Java organized a maritime trading state that, at its height in the 14th century, extended influence across much of maritime Southeast Asia, connecting trading networks that moved spices, textiles, ceramics, and other goods across the Indian Ocean world. The Srivijaya Maritime Empire preceded it, controlling the critical Strait of Malacca and organizing one of the most extensive maritime trade networks in the pre-modern world. The chiefdom societies of the Pacific, Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, developed sophisticated social organization, extraordinary maritime technology, and complex ritual systems that represent genuine social complexity even where they lack the monumental architecture that often draws archaeological attention. The question of how many civilizations have existed on Earth becomes even more complex and more interesting when you consider what the archaeological record cannot show us. The preservation bias in archaeology is severe and systematic. Archaeological evidence survives from some environments and contexts far better than from others. Stone survives well. Fired ceramic survives well. Bone survives in the right conditions, but wood, fiber, leather, and organic materials that constituted the majority of the material culture of most human societies disintegrate over centuries or millennia without leaving detectable traces. Societies that built in wood rather than stone, that kept records on perishable materials rather than clay tablets, that organized complex social and economic systems without the physical infrastructure that leaves clear archaeological signatures. These societies are systematically underrepresented in the record. The Amazonian case illustrates this dramatically. The Amazon basin, long assumed by Western scholars to have been too poor in resources and too environmentally challenging to support complex societies, has turned out, as LiDAR survey and other remote sensing technologies have been applied to the region to contain extensive evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian settlement. LiDAR surveys have revealed complex geometric earthworks covering vast areas, organized settlement patterns across enormous regions, and evidence of sophisticated land management, including the creation of terra preta, the deliberately modified dark soils found across much of Amazonia that represent massive human investment in agricultural infrastructure. The societies responsible for these earthworks and this landscape management are not well understood. They were not encountered by European explorers in the forms they had existed at their height. Epidemic disease moving ahead of direct contact had already devastated populations before most of the Amazon was directly visited by Europeans. But the physical evidence of their existence and their sophistication is increasingly undeniable, and it suggests that the Amazon basin hosted complex societies of considerable scale and organizational sophistication for thousands of years before European contact. Similarly, the application of LiDAR technology to other heavily vegetated regions, including parts of Central America, Southeast Asia, and tropical Africa, is consistently revealing evidence of complex human settlement and landscape modification that was invisible to conventional survey methods. Each new survey expands the known extent of past human complexity and pushes further the accounting of how many sophisticated societies have existed. The deep past, the period before 10,000 years ago, before the adoption of agriculture that most frameworks treat as the threshold of civilization, presents the most radical challenge to standard counts of civilizations. The hunter-gatherer societies that occupied the Earth for the first 200,000 or more years of human existence are typically treated in historical narratives as a kind of undifferentiated prehistory, people who existed before civilization, rather than people who organized complex societies of their own kinds. This treatment is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as the archaeological evidence for the deep past accumulates. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to roughly 11,500 years ago, was built by hunter-gatherers, people who were not farming, had no permanent settlements in the conventional sense, and should by the traditional framework have been incapable of the organizational complexity required to construct massive carved stone monuments. The site consists of multiple rings of large T-shaped limestone pillars, many elaborately carved with animal reliefs, organized in a complex that required sustained cooperative labor from many people over extended periods. It was not a settlement. No evidence of permanent habitation has been found there. It appears to have been a ritual gathering place, a center that drew people from across a large region for purposes that were social, spiritual, or ceremonial, rather than agricultural or administrative. What Göbekli Tepe reveals is that organizational complexity, the ability to coordinate large numbers of people toward a shared goal over extended time, preceded agriculture rather than following from it. The hunter-gatherers who built this site had the social infrastructure required for complex cooperative projects. They had whatever belief systems or social motivations drove the enormous investment of labor and skill that the site represents. They were not simple bands of foragers existing below the threshold of complexity. They were people organized in ways sophisticated enough to build monuments that have survived 11,000 years. If this level of complexity existed 11,000 years ago in one place, how many other complex hunter-gatherer societies existed across the same period and the preceding millennia, leaving traces less dramatic and less durable than carved limestone? The honest answer is that we do not know. And the absence of evidence from perishable materials and impermanent structures is not evidence of absence of complexity. The question of how many civilizations humanity has had, therefore, does not have a clean numerical answer. It has a range of answers depending on definition, and each answer in that range is interesting for different reasons. If civilization requires writing, urban centers, and the full traditional checklist, the answer is somewhere between 30 and 60 distinct civilizations depending on how you count regional variants and independent developments, still considerably more than the standard narrative acknowledges, but bounded by the strictness of the criteria. If civilization means large-scale complex society, with sophisticated political organization, economic specialization, and significant material culture, the number expands to several hundred across human history, including the pre-Columbian American societies, the sub-Saharan African kingdoms, the Southeast Asian maritime empires, the complex chiefdoms of the Pacific, and the numerous sophisticated societies of regions typically treated as peripheral in world history. If civilization means any society demonstrating significant organizational complexity, the number becomes very large indeed. Potentially thousands if you include the complex societies of the deep past whose evidence is incomplete but whose existence is increasingly supported by archaeology. And if you include the civilizations that existed and left no detectable archaeological trace, societies that organize complex social, economic, and ritual life using perishable materials in environments that destroy organic evidence. Then the true number of sophisticated human societies across 300,000 years of human existence is unknowable, but certainly vastly larger than any count based on surviving evidence can capture. The historian at the desk has now been sitting there for considerably longer than expected. The piece of paper has notes on both sides and has been supplemented by 3 additional sheets. The answer they are arriving at is something like this. The standard narrative of human civilization is a tiny, biased sample of the actual historical record, weighted toward literate, stone building, politically centralized societies in specific geographic regions that happen to be studied intensively by European scholars during the 19th and 20th centuries. The actual number of complex human societies that have existed is much larger, by orders of magnitude in some counting frameworks, and the diversity of those societies is much greater than any narrative focused on a dozen ancient civilizations can represent. More significantly, the question reveals something important about human potential. If the conservative count of distinct civilizations with writing and urban centers is 30 to 60, and those 30 to 60 civilizations were developed independently in different parts of the world from different cultural and environmental starting points, then the capacity to organize complex societies is not a peculiar achievement of one tradition that spread outward, but a recurring, robust tendency of the human species across diverse contexts. Complexity keeps happening. Given time and the right conditions, human groups keep producing sophisticated social organization, monumental expression, long-distance trade, and elaborate cultural systems. It has happened in river valleys and on high plateaus, in tropical forests and Arctic environments, on islands and across continental interiors. The Earth has had many civilizations. The exact number depends on definitions we invented and can revise. What the evidence does not leave in doubt is that the number is much larger than most people walking around right now believe, and that the story of human complexity is considerably richer, more geographically diverse, and more remarkable than the standard narrative has ever managed to convey. The historian puts the pen down. Several sheets of paper covered in notes. One question still. Productively open. That is, in the end, the most honest answer available. More than you think, and we are still finding out how many more.